Right, the latest on the engine that's going to be known as Asbo number 50, and I've shortened the cylinder barrel now, and that is ready to go away and be rebored to take the new piston I've got for it. And that leads me to why I've got the old piston in there. This is obviously on a standard bore, and the old piston is also standard. Obviously I wouldn't be able to fit the new piston in there until it's bored out, but I wanted to just try, in view of the minimal or even negligible sort of side to side thrust available on the conrod through the big end and its location between the flywheels, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to cause any binding of the piston in the cylinder as it moves up and down, and everything's moving nice and freely there, so that's not a worry at all. That tells me that the conrod is lined up nice and central in the crankcases, and it's running true and parallel and perpendicular to the crankcase joint and the cylinder bore. So that's put my mind at ease quite a bit, that I can turn that freely with the piston. There's no rings on that piston, but even so I'm turning it pretty easily, and there's no snagging or binding as the piston goes up and down the bore, so I'm very happy with that. So I'll get this off now, take the old piston off again, and I can take the aluminium cylinder barrel to be bored so that it will be suitable to accept the 40 thou oversize 9:1 American made piston. So a bit of progress and a bit of peace of mind, I would say. Here we are with Asbo number 50, and I've got the engine bottom end all put together and connected up to the gearbox and put the whole lot back into the frame. All the engine plates are present and the nuts and bolts and all tightened up and everything. I even timed the ignition. Got the inlet cam retarded there, all ready to go. And I did this off my own bat while I was waiting to hear back regarding the lack of side to side movement in the conrod on the big end. And I sort of had been hoping that maybe I might get told, no, don't worry, that's how it's meant to be, everything will be fine. But instead of that, unfortunately, I was told that, oh, there seems to be a small number of crank pins that were made 12 thousandths of an inch too short across the big end, and obviously I've got one of them. So I've got to take it all apart again, and it was coming along pretty nicely too. I even got the crank when I put it together. I didn't even have to bump the flywheels, to be honest. It came together and recorded no more than 1.5 thousandths of an inch run out on the main shafts. I don't think I'll be that lucky again second time round when I fit this crank pin here that I've been sent to replace the one that's in there, which this one, by all accounts, from there to there is 12 thousandths of an inch longer or wider, which would explain why I don't have the side to side float or rock that I would have expected to see there. So unfortunately it's go back 3 spaces, Paul, and take this all to bits and do it again. But I guess it's better to sort of find that out at this stage than when you've got a complete running engine and be told that what you got in there can't be guaranteed. So I'm going to roll my sleeves up now and get this lot back out and split the crank again, get that crank pin out, put this one in, and then start all over again. Right, well, I've got the engine bottom end out of the frame of Asbo number 50 again, and here it is all in bits, and I've got the flywheel split again and the crank pin out, and I've been sent a replacement for it, and hopefully I'm going to show here the difference. On the right is a crank pin of the correct width, and on the left is the crank pin that I had in there, which was causing the conrod to bind and not sort of revolve around the big end freely. And I've got this set up, whether or not that can be seen, that's showing 1 inch, and I've got across the shoulders of that crank pin I'm getting 1 inch, and just to sort of demonstrate. I can't waggle that vernier around at all on that. That's a close sort of sliding fit across from one shoulder to the other. No free play. I come to this one, the one that I had in there, and we got that. Now, like I say, that's an inch there, that one. And if you want to bear with me, I'll try and get a measurement for the other one. I'm told that this crank pin is in the region of about 12 thousandths of an inch too narrow across the big end. Let's see what we've got. So I hope the camera might pick the numbers up on this. The light's a bit sort of glary in here. I'll have a look at it. We are, get my magic eye. Well, it's such a tiny amount under, it probably actually is only in the region of maybe, what have we got, 10 thousandths of an inch or so, perhaps narrower than the other one, but that would give me the free space I need side to side on the conrod to let it spin freely around the big end and to give a good unrestricted passageway for any oil pumped into the big end to get out and around the sides and get flung up to the piston, rather than relying on lifting the relief valve in the down inside flywheel there. So we'll get more amount of oil going through the big end and cooling it than there would have been with the closer fit. And of course it's correct, which is another nice thing. But now all I've got to do is put it all back together again. You may actually be able to see that this one actually looks slightly narrower to the naked eye across the big end area, shoulder to shoulder, than that one. But I'm going to put it all back together now and go through the truing process again. And you wouldn't believe it, but when I put it together last time, I didn't even have to bump the flywheels. I just put it together to what I thought would roughly be in the zone, ready to be truing it, and as I pressed it together and took readings, I got it all the way home and I had 1.5 thousandths of an inch run out. I don't suppose I'm going to get that lucky again, but here we go for the second time, and I bet that's probably the shortest time that any crank pin has spent in an engine, and the engine didn't even run. So that's got to be some sort of record. But onwards and upwards, get this put back together now, get the engine bottom end cases put back together, gearbox on, back into the frame, and I'll be back where I was, waiting for the aluminium cylinder barrel to be rebored. So yes, onward and upward with everything. Here we are with the crankshaft assembly for Asbo number 50 again. This is getting like Groundhog Day, and I've already lightened and rebalanced the flywheels, as we've already seen. And I actually assembled them and trued them once before as well, but the conrod was binding a little bit between the thrust washers and the flywheels, and it turns out that the crank pin I was supplied was in the region of 10 to 12 thousandths of an inch too short across the big end journal, shoulder to shoulder. So I was sent a replacement and I fitted it, and I've pressed up the flywheels once again, trued them, and I've got the crank pin nuts fitted and tightened as well. And what we've got, as usual, in thousandths of an inch, probably got about 1/2 thousandth of an inch on that one. That one is showing 2 thousandths of an inch. The needles are rising and falling together, so I've got 1.5 thousandths of an inch run out, which is the same as I had before I ran into all this trouble. And this time I should be able to put the crank back in the crank cases and spin the crank freely, but also demonstrate that the conrod flops around nicely on its big end as well. And there is a tiny little bit, whether the camera will pick it up, it's a tiny little bit of, you can actually hear that, tiny bit of side to side movement on that conrod now that we didn't have before. So I feel more comfortable about that, in that it's going to allow more generous oil flow through and out of the sides of the big end there, rather than relying on lifting the relief valve as much as it probably would have done, and possibly starving the big end of oil, and the big end probably running hot due to friction between it and the thrust washers as well. So that's all as it should be now. I'm certainly very happy with those run out figures. I wasn't sure I was ever going to get them down to that sort of level again, but that's every bit as good as last time, if not a little bit better actually. So I'll put this crank into the engine now, into the crankcases, put the gearbox onto the back of them, get it back in the frame again, and I'll be back where I was when I started this morning, when I took it out and split the cases to get this out and do the job. So I'm almost a happy bunny. Get that lot back together and we'll pick up from there. Here we are for the second time around, with the crankcases clamped together with the crankshaft assembly inside, in all the main bearings and everything, and I'll demonstrate it spinning nice and easily. Get hold of the timing side shaft there, spin it between finger and thumb, and there's the conrod behaving as it should as well. Now the only thing I can't really do this time is demonstrate the crank spinning back up under its counterbalance. You can see it sort of trying to start on its way back, but it's not getting going, and the reason for that is the crank is just as true, if not slightly better than it was before. But I've got the crank seals fitted, I've got the drive side oil seal in there, and I've got the timing side oil seal in there, and they were fitted since I last tried spinning the last incarnation of the crank back and forth, and obviously they grab on the main shafts ever so slightly, and that's what's stopping it from rolling back under its own counterweight this time. But it's spinning nice and freely, and the conrod's spinning on the big end as it should now as well, so I'm very happy with that. So I'll bolt the crankcases back together again, fit all the studs and nuts, put the gearbox back on once again and get it back into the frame, and we can pick up where we left off. And finally we should be on the way of putting Asbo 50 together for the first time in its tuned up form, and perhaps inching closer to being able to see what it goes like when it's eventually done. Here we are one more time with Asbo 50, and I've worked on a little bit today, and I've actually got the engine back together and bolted up with the gearbox and into the frame, as we can see here. I've built up the primary drive, timed the ignition, camshafts are in and the inlet's retarded. I've used the oil can here. I like to pump a bit of oil in through the end feed of the crank, through the seal, before I put the timing cover on. I've done that. I've checked the oil pumps, I've had them out and had a look, and they're good. It's got the high capacity pumps on it, which is fine with the roller big end anyway. We'll have no excessive pressure there, but we'll have extra flow, so that's good. I fitted a new oil filter into the oil filter chamber before I put the timing cover on, as I always do, so that I can turn the timing cover 90 degrees so the open end of the chamber is facing upwards, and I can pour oil in so it's actually full of oil ready to go. That I've got a load of oil in a crankcase, as I've said. I've pumped it through the seal in the worm nut in there. I've also pumped quite a bit of oil into the timing chest through here as well, so there's plenty of oil everywhere in that engine for when it's started up. Obviously I've still got to fill the oil tank part of it up, but I know that there's oil in the crankcase, there's oil in the timing chest, there's oil in the filter housing. We're all ready for the top end when it comes back. And that big end is the conrod's flopping around there as you'd normally expect it should, so I'm pretty happy with that. Cylinder head, I've done all the work on that, ported it and ground the valves in, cleaned them, polished them, everything. So as soon as I get the cylinder barrel back, that top end can go back on and I can think about getting it running. But I'm glad that I've turned that crankpin business around and we're back here, and we run out figures, we're nice and low on the crank again, so I'm happy to call it a day.